I woke to the beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic, fingers numb, heart thinner than the hospital gown around me. Outside my door, the world kept moving, laughter, music, the careless click of heels, while I lay tethered to tubes and fear. My parents stood at a choice, the place where I fought for breath, or a party for the brother who never once sat by my bed. They chose the party. They left me in the ICU with doctors whispering that I might not make it. When you realize the people who were supposed to protect you traded your life for celebration, something inside you breaks and hardens. I remember feeling small, like a thing misplaced, then a slow, bright anger spreading through me until survival felt small next to what I wanted them to feel. This isn't a story about hospital gowns or medical charts. It's about what I decided to become after they walked away, how quiet, furious plan replaced my fear, and how every breath I took became part of a promise. I'm not telling you this for pity. I'm telling you because what I did next changed everything for them, for me, and for the truth they tried to bury. Do you want to see how far I went to make them pay? Before everything fell apart, my life was painfully ordinary, steady, predictable, even peaceful in its routines. I lived with my parents and my younger brother, Daniel, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every front yard looked the same and every Sunday smelled of freshly cut grass. My days were divided between work at the local bookstore and evenings spent helping my mother prepare dinner, listening to her endless praise of Daniel's achievements. He was their golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. I was the background character in my own home, always the helper, never the highlight. Still, I tried to convince myself I was happy. I found comfort in the little things, organizing the shelves at work, taking long walks home when the air was cool, writing in my journal about the life I dreamed of having. I told myself love didn't have to be loud, that quiet affection was enough. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear them laughing in the next room, my parents and Daniel, and feel that familiar ache. The kind that tells you you're present, but invisible. Then came the faint signs I ignored, how my parents' smiles flickered when I entered the room, how Daniel's laughter grew sharper when the conversation turned to me. My mother began canceling our weekly movie nights, saying she was too tired. My father, who used to check in on me after work, stopped asking how my day went. I told myself they were just busy. Families drift. It happens. But deep down, something was shifting, something I didn't want to name. When the headaches started, I thought it was just stress. I was exhausted, barely sleeping, pushing through each day with caffeine and stubbornness. The pain grew worse, sharp enough to make my vision blur, but I didn't want to worry anyone. I didn't want to give them another reason to sigh at my weakness. When I finally collapsed at work, the panic in my manager's eyes told me it was bad. I remember the ambulance sirens, the cold sting of oxygen, the words "critical condition," echoing somewhere far away. At the hospital, I caught brief glimpses of my parents, my mother crying into her hands, my father pacing, Daniel scrolling on his phone. I wanted to believe they cared, that fear had brought them back to me. But even then, lying under harsh fluorescent lights, I felt a strange distance. Their words were careful, almost rehearsed. My mother said, "You'll be fine, sweetheart," but her eyes looked past me. Daniel complained about missing some party, and my father said, "We can't keep everyone waiting." I told myself they'd stay. They had to. Family doesn't leave when you're hanging between life and death, right? As the night crept in, the machines hummed a steady rhythm beside me, the sound both comforting and haunting. Nurses whispered about my vitals, doctors murmured about the risks, and I drifted in and out of consciousness. Once, I thought I heard my father say, "She'll be fine." They always exaggerate these things. And then, just like that, they were gone. The next morning, when I woke up alone, I tried to convince myself they'd gone home to rest. But the nurse who checked my force said softly, "Your family left for a party. Your brother's birthday, I think." She said it without malice, just a simple fact. Something inside me cracked quietly. Not a loud, dramatic break, but a slow, suffocating realization that I wasn't worth staying for. That even in my most fragile moment, celebration mattered more than my life. That was the day I stopped waiting for their love to find me. I didn't know it yet, but a different kind of strength had started to take root. The kind born not from being cared for, but from surviving when no one cared at all. They left a bruise on the hours, those empty, echoing hours after I came out of the haze. Time stretched around me like gauze, each minute soaked in a quiet that felt deliberate, as if the world had been paused by people who chose to keep living. When I finally had enough clarity to move, the first thing I did was look for them. The second thing I did was find the proof. It started as a small, stubborn curiosity, an attempt to stitch together the blank spaces in my memory. My phone lay beside me, a dull rectangle that had become a ledger of everything I hadn't noticed. At first, there were ordinary things. Missed calls from the hospital, messages from friends, the automated updates that hospitals send when a loved one's condition changes. Then I found photos, pictures that should never have existed. My parents in a living room lit with party lights, glasses raised, Daniel laughing with a cake in front of him. There was a slow, sinking feeling as if someone had shoved ice down my throat. The timestamps were the cruelest punctuation. While for lines fed medicine into my arm and nurses scribbled notes, they posed for pictures. That was the first crack. The next cracks came faster, each one more precise than the last. I discovered bank notifications, small, mundane alerts that told their own story. Transfers marked as gift and celebration, payments for a venue booked the night I was intubated, a florist bill sent at the same hour my monitors flatlined. The mundane clerks of the digital age had no sense of mercy. They revealed everything people thought could be hidden by a smile or an excuse. Anger is an animal that arrives when grief has nowhere to go. It came for me then, all hot and raw, and with it a new kind of focus. I read every message, every payment, every blurred, careless photo until the pattern was clear. I was collateral, an inconvenience to be managed while life continued as if I had not been the axis everything turned on. It wasn't just that they left. It was that they chose celebration over presence, ritual over responsibility. There was a grotesque arithmetic to it. I began to catalog not just their absence but their priorities, and the more I cataloged, the more I realized this was not an accident of terrible timing. It felt deliberate, or at least comfortably indifferent. But proof alone does not break a family. Proof is a shard. It cuts, but it does not topple. I needed context. Why had they chosen that night? What had changed between the feigned tenderness of past years and the cold ease of abandonment? The answers were not simple confessions. Families rarely crumble neatly. They unspooled in the margins. Overheard phrases I had once dismissed, a ledger left open on the kitchen counter, a contract that listed Daniel as the sole beneficiary of something that had once been ours collectively. The more I uncovered, the more an ugly narrative took shape. Daniel had been collecting favors, cultivating connections, and my parents had, for reasons I could not yet accept, rewarded that cultivation with devotion and resources. I had been quietly erased. There was betrayal, yes, but also a deeper ugliness. Complicity. The thought of complicity cut deeper than abandonment because it implied choice. They had chosen not merely to leave. They had chosen to prioritize an image, a status, a child who fit an ideal. I replayed memories, small gestures that suddenly looked like transactions. The dinners where my accomplishments were met with polite silence while Daniel's phone calls elicited praise. The scholarship I had earned was discussed like an inconvenience. The charity event where my mother lingered only long enough to be seen beside a smiling, booming sun. Each memory rearranged itself into proof. Anger became planning without a detailed notebook. It was a steady narrowing of intent. I could have screamed. I could have sat in the hospital lobby and waited for shame to find its way back to them. Instead, I learned to watch. I watched how they presented themselves to the world, how carefully they curated their image, a warm family, proud of their son with bright prospects. I watched how small lies congealed into a narrative they could sell at holidays and on social media. It blinded other people. It had blinded me for so long. When I left the hospital, it was with a resolve not yet named. Recovery was its own battlefield, my body weakened, my spirit honed. Each step outside the hospital was a calibration of will. I went back to the bookstore for a few hours, pretending that normalcy could plug the hole. But normalcy was a costume I refused to wear for long. I needed traction. I needed leverage. I found leverage in the places they had overlooked. There were receipts tucked into a drawer, a contract folded under a stack of magazines, a voicemail that had been accidentally saved on a phone no one thought to purge. These were small things, ordinary things, but they mapped a pattern. Promises made to Daniel in whispers, favors exchanged for signatures, assurances that certain obligations, my obligations, were negotiable. I traced the threads and realized that the family's public story was not merely embellished, it was constructed. And constructions have seams. The next step was ruthless in its simplicity, gathering witnesses who did not care about their curated image. A neighbor who had delivered balloons that night and found the house oddly loud for celebration while one of their own lay in crisis. A nurse who remembered the time my mother hesitated to sign a consent form and then left in a hurry. An old friend of my father's who mentioned an offhand comment about keeping appearances. These were not dramatic testimonies for a courtroom drama. They were shards of human truth, each one a small eruption of reality into the glossy life my family projected. As I built this quiet dossier, something else happened. My anger began to deepen into a strategy, not of violence, but of exposure. Revenge, for me, felt righteous when it illuminated rather than destroyed. I could have bent the rules of pain. Instead, I focused on turning the light toward their choices, to force a reckoning in the open. I imagined a public mirror, a slow reflection that would reveal what my family had chosen to hide. It would not fix what had been done to me, but it could crack their complacency in a way that pierced their comfortable life. There were nights I sat at my desk, hands trembling not from weakness, but from the magnitude of what I intended. I pictured the moment when their careful performance would stutter, the pause at a gathering, the message that could not be deleted, the look of someone realizing their image had a stain that would not come out with soap. I felt a quiet vindication in the thought, not a gleeful celebration of their fall, but a righteous insistence that consequences mattered. It wasn't enough to hurt them. I wanted them to understand. The closer I came to action, the more dangerous the silence became. I could almost hear them, in their home, moving through the motions of normal life, perhaps confident that the world would continue to accept the lie. Their complacency was both my weapon and my warning. If I moved too fast, they might anticipate, defend, and bury the truth. If I moved too slowly, their narrative would ossify. The balance felt surgical. I made contact with a journalist who wrote quietly, but incisively about family secrets and social facades. I sat across from her in a small cafe, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup, and told a version of my story that left out nothing crucial but spared no necessary detail. She listened without pity and with an attention that felt like a rare kindness. She asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. She suggested angles that turned private betrayal into public accountability. I felt a new kind of courage germinate in that exchange. This was not just about personal vengeance anymore. It was about truth. As the plan took shape, there were moments I doubted the morality of what I was doing. I replayed my motivations until they were plain and unadorned, to make them face what they had chosen, to refuse invisibility, to reclaim a narrative that had been stolen. The moral fog cleared when I remembered the smell of antiseptic and the beeps of machines that had kept me alive while they chose music and candles. That memory anchored me in a clarity that made moral compromise unnecessary. The goal was not to ruin, it was to reveal. And then, just as everything seemed arranged, the evidence lined up, the witnesses ready, the media contact briefed, something shifted in my periphery. A new message arrived on an old account, one I had thought dormant, a single photograph, different from the others, taken at the edge of the party. It was a picture of Daniel, looking not triumphant but anxious, a hand pressed to his mouth as if to stop words from falling out. The image was small, grainy, almost insignificant, but it hinted at a door I had not yet opened. What was Daniel hiding, and how far would his secrets bend the consequences I was about to set loose? The answer to that question hung in the air like a held breath. I could feel the moment coming when the soft, careful lie my family had spent years constructing would either crack or consolidate. I had staked everything on the crack. Now all I could do was step forward and see whether the truth would finally be allowed to land. The moment came like the cut of a blade, precise, quick, and impossible to unfeel. I had rehearsed nothing and everything in my head, the order of documents, the image files, the names to hand over, the single paragraph that would make a private cruelty undeniable in public. I did not stand on a stage or shout. I used the thing they trusted most, their reputation, and turned it against them. I sent the package at dawn. It was simple and merciless. A carefully composed email to the journalist, an attachment with timestamps and receipts, a folder of photos labeled by hour, and the recording of a voicemail that could not be explained away. I hit send with a hand that did not shake. For years they had curated a life that looked perfect in thumbnails and holiday snapshots. I gave the world the uncropped version. By midday the story began to move. The journalist's voice, measured, quiet, efficient, had done what my fury alone could not. She framed the facts so that even strangers could feel the weight of the choice my family had made. Her piece was not an accusation in the style of a scream, but a simple illumination of events laid side by side until the truth stared back. It landed like gravel on a still street, a sound that made people look up. I watched from the corner of the cafe where I had first met her, my coffee gone cold and untouched. My phone buzzed once, twice, then exploded with notifications, shares, messages, tags. The post threaded outward. Friends of friends, colleagues, distant acquaintances who had once accepted the family's glossy image now paused and clicked. People I hadn't spoken to in years messaged with short, stunned comments. The world rearranged itself around an inconvenient truth, and I felt the dangerous, dizzying thrill of that rearrangement. They were at a party when the first notifications reached them. It was a charity evening, lamps dimmed, servers gliding, speeches scheduled. Everything staged to reflect the life they wanted to be known for. I pictured the room. Glasses clinking, someone making a toast, Daniel's smile practiced and bright. I imagined how that image would begin to deteriorate, pixel by pixel, as phones lit up and whispers started. It was a small cruelty to choose timing like that, but timing had been my teacher. The first reaction I saw was in my father's face when a friend nudged him and held up a screen. For an instant, he looked like a man trying to remember where he had left a thought. Then a flicker of recognition, then fear. My mother's hand went to her cheek as if to steady herself against a physical blow. Daniel's expression did something unpracticed. The smile cracked and left him raw. I was not there in that room, but I felt each micro-movement like a chord struck inside me. Social media does not wait politely. Screens capture the falter of a person who has been pretending for a long time. Messages from acquaintances turned into public comments. People they had once smiled beside now asked quiet, pointed questions out loud. The charity's organizer, faced with the headline on his phone, excused himself and moved toward a manager with a look that was almost in order. Conversation stuttered, and then halted. The curated performance stuttered, then stopped. I did not watch only for punishment. I watched for recognition, whether they would see themselves in the rawness I had exposed. When a video began to circulate from the party, a shaky clip of my father standing at the microphone, face pale, voice faltering as he attempted to explain, as if explanation alone could stitch what had been torn, I felt a complicated triumph. He spoke into a silence that was not mercy, but a dawning comprehension. The words did not absolve. They were small, human, and wholly inadequate. Then came the hardest part, seeing Daniel. My brother had been the axis around which their choices turned. He was, in some quiet way, the map and the compass. Now, with the internet as an unblinking mirror, he could no longer hide behind their smiles. I watched a string of photographs appear, his face at the party, then him stepping aside to take a phone call, then him staring at the screen with a hand pressed to his mouth. That photograph we had found earlier, the one that suggested anxiety rather than triumph, bloomed into meaning. People began to tag him. People began to ask who he was in relation to all of this. The questions were not accusations so much as shards of light that cut through the carefully glossed veneer. I felt no jubilation in their discomfort. Instead, there was a quiet, electrical settling in me, like a storm moving beyond the horizon. The goal had never been to watch them suffer for its own sake, but to make them encounter what they had chosen to ignore, a life left unattended under fluorescent lights while music played somewhere else. The exposure forced a conversation they had evaded, and conversations do something that silence never can. They alter what is possible next. In the space that opened, people began to call for accountability. An old friend of my father's posted a reluctant comment about responsibility. A neighbor shared the memory of the balloons delivered that night, small confirmations from small, human witnesses. The journalist published follow-ups, connecting dots I had only hinted at. The domestic ledger I'd found, contracts, transfers, favors, became more than a private crime scene. It became evidence of pattern. Institutions that once nodded politely in the family's presence now asked for explanations. There was, however, a moment that almost buckled me, the instant when consequences lifted from the abstract to the personal. My phone buzzed with a private message from someone close to them, a plea that cut through the public din, a request to meet, to explain, to make sense. For a heartbeat, I imagined a quick, tidy reconciliation. Their tears, their promises, the forgiving bowls and patched things. It would have been easier, softer, less dangerous to accept that script. But the ledger of my own survival, the memory of the beeping in a room where no one chose me, would not allow a neat closure. The cost of that ease would be erasing what had been exposed. At the peak of that storm, with the public gaze now fixed on them, I made one last choice. I released one more piece of the puzzle, not to shame, but to compel responsibility. It was a document that linked benefits and promises to decisions, a quiet administrative truth that had been treated like a family secret. When it became public, the legal center of their life trembled. The charity event that had been a showcase for generosity became a site of questions about the distribution of favors and the ethics of prominence. People who had once smiled in their photos began to make careful statements. Invitations were rescinded. Honors were postponed. The consequences were practical and merciless in their mundanity. I watched all of it with an odd mixture of exhaustion and relief. The air in my lungs felt different. It was not filled with the anticipatory smoke of planning, but with the clean, cold clarity that follows action. The world had seen what I had been too small to make others notice in private. The truth was no longer a whisper in my hospital room. It had a shape outside of me, and that shape would have to be navigated by those who had built the lie. As the night deepened and the dust settled, I felt a weight lift. Not the weight of vindictiveness, but the weight of invisibility. I had forced a reflection in a place that valued appearances over reality. Whether they chose contrition, denial, or flight, they could no longer pretend ignorance. Whatever happened next would not be entirely in my hands. The truth I had set loose had its own momentum now. And then, at the edge of everything, a single notification arrived, a brief message from Daniel that contained only a single, loaded image, his hand on a closed envelope, my name on the outside. The envelope suggested a choice I had not yet anticipated. It implied contact, a confession, or perhaps something worse. I stared at that image until the night blurred, and the question it posed hung in the air like a held breath. Would he step forward into truth, or would he disappear into a silence as carefully constructed as the one that had buried me? I didn't sleep that night. The silence after everything ended felt louder than any scream I'd ever held back. My revenge was done. The truth was out, and those who broke me were finally brought to their knees. But as I stared at the aftermath, I couldn't tell if I'd won or just lost something far more precious. They said revenge would make me feel better, that it would finally silence the ache that had been living inside me for so long. But as the chaos settled, I realized there was no peace, just quiet. The kind of quiet that forces you to face the parts of yourself you'd buried beneath anger. When I saw their faces, shock, guilt, fear, it should have satisfied me. For months, I had imagined that moment, them trembling as their lies came crashing down. But when it happened, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty, like I'd become everything I swore I'd never be. I remember walking out that night, rain pouring so hard it felt like the world was trying to wash everything clean. My clothes were soaked, my hands still shaking, but my heart was strangely calm. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. The truth was mine now, and so was my pain. People later told me I was brave for standing up, for exposing them. They called me strong. But they didn't see the nights after, the silence, the guilt, the moments when I questioned whether I'd gone too far. Because revenge isn't clean. It doesn't end neatly like in movies. It stains you in ways you can't scrub out. For a long time, I avoided mirrors. Not because I didn't like what I saw, but because I didn't recognize her, the woman staring back. She wasn't the same girl who once believed people were good, that love could fix anything. She was harder now, sharper. But maybe that was necessary. It took time, months of solitude, reflection, and countless sleepless nights to understand what my story really meant. My revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about reclaiming power, about refusing to let their betrayal define who I became. I didn't destroy them to feel alive again. I faced them to remind myself that I still was. But there's a cost. Every act of vengeance carries a shadow. And even when the fire dies, the smoke lingers. Sometimes I wonder if forgiveness would have been easier, if walking away would have made me lighter. But then I remember the nights I cried myself to sleep, begging for justice that never came. I remember how they laughed, how they lied, how they made me doubt my own reality. And I realize I couldn't have moved on without standing up first. So no, I don't regret what I did. I regret what made it necessary. In the end, revenge didn't fix me. It revealed me. It stripped away every illusion, every piece of naivety I once held, and showed me who I truly was when pushed to the edge. And maybe that's the real power of revenge. It forces you to confront your own darkness. I've learned that closure doesn't always come with peace. Sometimes it comes with acceptance, accepting that some wounds will always ache, that some apologies will never come, and that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about surviving. Now, when I look back, I see the woman I became through it all. Not the broken version of myself who needed revenge, but the one who found strength in her scars. Because yes, revenge left marks. But those marks remind me of everything I endured and everything I overcame. If you've ever been betrayed, if someone's hurt you so deeply you thought you'd never breathe the same again, I want you to know something. Revenge might give you justice, but it won't give you peace. That part you have to build yourself. So here's what I've learned. Don't let them take your heart. Don't let them decide who you become. Because once you reclaim your power, they can never break you again. And maybe that's what real revenge is, not watching them fall, but watching yourself rise. Now, when people ask me if it was worth it, I just smile and say, it depends what you think winning means. Because for me, winning wasn't about ruining their lives. It was about rebuilding mine. And if my story makes even one person stop and think before they break someone's trust, before they play with someone's heart, then maybe all the pain was worth it. So tell me, would you have done the same?